Sometimes, life takes everything from you in the blink of an eye. A storm, a landslide, a tragedy that leaves nothing but questions behind. For 30 years, Henry Sullivan has lived in the shadow of a mystery. The disappearance of his only daughter, Emily, the night his world was torn apart. Now, as time slips through his fingers, an unexpected encounter reignites a flame he thought had long been extinguished. A young woman, a birthmark, a past that refuses to stay buried. But the truth is never simple, and some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. Who is she? What really happened that night? And most importantly, what happens when the past refuses to stay in the past? Stay until the end, and don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had been relentless that night, pounding against the windshield as Henry Sullivan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The road was slick, winding through the darkened countryside, and the headlights barely cut through the heavy downpour. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, her fingers trembling as she clutched the edge of her seat. In the back, their 8-year-old daughter, Emily, was bundled in a blanket, her small frame shaking. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Henry forced a reassuring smile, though his knuckles had turned white against the steering wheel. "It's just a little rain, sweetheart. We're almost home." But he knew it was more than that. Something about this storm felt wrong. The winds howled, trees swayed dangerously along the roadside, and the sky rumbled with an anger he couldn't explain. Margaret glanced at him, concern deep in her brown eyes. "Henry, maybe we should pull over until it passes." But before he could respond, the road beneath them trembled. A deafening crack echoed through the night as an enormous tree crashed down in front of them, blocking their path. Henry slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, the car skidded, and then, in an instant, the world turned upside down. The vehicle slid off the road, tumbling down an embankment as Margaret let out a terrified scream. The impact was brutal. Henry's head hit the dashboard, and for a moment, everything was black. When he opened his eyes, the car was half submerged in a raging flood of muddy water. His ears rang, his chest ached, but nothing mattered except the two voices he needed to hear. "Margaret!" He turned to his wife, but her seat was empty. The passenger door was wide open, the river pulling her away. "No, no, no, Margaret!" He lunged forward, but his seatbelt held him in place. His hands fumbled with the buckle, adrenaline pumping, heart racing. Then he heard the second voice. "Daddy!" Emily's cry was desperate, filled with fear. He turned, spotting her in the back seat, struggling against the rising water. He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her tiny hand, when the current surged through the shattered windows. Emily's body was ripped from his grasp. "No, Emily!" He thrashed, fought against the water, tried to hold on, but she was gone. The river swallowed her whole. The next few minutes were a blur. Rescuers pulled Henry from the wreckage, shouting orders, flashing lights in his dazed eyes. He screamed for his wife, for his daughter, but all he heard in response was the wailing wind and the crackle of the emergency radio. "We found the wife downstream," one voice muttered. Henry barely registered the words before another spoke, the ones that would haunt him for the next 30 years. "The girl, she's gone." Days passed in a fog of disbelief. They searched, they dragged the river, combed the banks, questioned every witness. But Emily was never found. Henry Sullivan never stopped searching. Even when the police declared her dead. Even when the town whispered behind his back, telling stories of how grief had driven him mad. Even when time wore away at his body, leaving him with gray hair, weary bones, and a heart weighed down by loss. 30 years had passed. 30 years of unanswered prayers. And now, as he sat in the vast, empty halls of his mansion, staring at a faded photograph of his little girl, he felt the cruel weight of time pressing down on him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Evelyn, his housekeeper for the last 2 decades, entered with cautious steps. "Mr. Sullivan, your new nurse has arrived." Henry barely acknowledged her, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Send her in." A moment later, footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. "Good evening, Mr. Sullivan. I'm Grace Turner. It's an honor to take care of you." The voice was soft, familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Henry looked up, and for the first time in years, his breath caught in his throat. The young woman standing before him had long, dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a gentle smile. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the small, distinct birthmark on her right cheek. A mark identical to the one Emily had. His pulse pounded. His mind screamed. It wasn't possible. But as he stared at her, he felt something deep in his chest. A pull, an instinct, a whisper of the past that refused to stay buried. "Mr. Sullivan?" Grace's voice was uncertain, her brows knitting together. "Are you all right?" Henry swallowed, his throat dry as paper. He could barely force the words past his lips. "Where did you come from?" Grace hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I grew up in foster care. I don't know much about my early years." His hands trembled as he reached for the photograph on his desk, his fingers ghosting over the image of his lost daughter. His heart pounded against his ribs, years of grief, desperation, and unanswered questions slamming into him all at once. Could it be? Could fate be so cruel as to dangle this possibility before him? Or was he finally losing his mind? Evelyn watched from the doorway, her face carefully neutral. But deep in her eyes, a flicker of something unreadable lingered, something that made Henry's stomach twist. He turned back to Grace, struggling to breathe. "Do you have any childhood memories?" Grace frowned. "Not before I was 9. Henry's blood ran cold. He gripped the armrest of his chair as the room seemed to tilt. For 3 decades he had begged for a sign, a clue, a miracle. And now, staring into the face of a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, he felt the earth shift beneath his feet. If Grace Turner was who he thought she was, then someone had spent the last 30 years ensuring she never found out. And Henry Sullivan was about to tear that secret apart. Henry Sullivan could barely breathe. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of 3 decades of grief, loss, and an unanswered question that had haunted him every single day. He couldn't take his eyes off the young woman standing before him. Grace Turner. That name meant nothing to him, but the face, the birthmark. It was as if the past had walked right into his house, shattering the fragile world he had built around his sorrow. She watched him with a mix of concern and confusion, shifting uncomfortably under his intense gaze. "Mr. Sullivan, should I call someone? You look pale." Henry blinked, forcing himself to regain control. His hands clenched against the armrests of his chair. He had spent so many years chasing ghosts that now, faced with the impossible, he didn't know what to do. He wanted to grab her shoulders, to search her face for the truth. But instead, he swallowed his desperation and forced his voice to remain steady. "No, I'm fine," he managed, though he was anything but. He leaned forward slightly. "You said you grew up in foster care?" Grace nodded, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Yes, I don't remember much before I was 9. I was told I was found abandoned. No records of my biological parents. I spent most of my childhood in group homes until I was adopted when I was 12. Henry felt his pulse thunder in his ears. 9 years old. That was just 1 year after Emily had disappeared. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. He turned his gaze to Evelyn, who stood quietly near the door, her expression unreadable. Evelyn had been with him for over 20 years. She had witnessed his grief, his obsessive search, his slow descent into loneliness. And yet, as she looked at Grace, Henry noticed something. A flicker of recognition. "You've never seen her before, have you, Evelyn?" His voice was sharp, but calm. The housekeeper stiffened just slightly before shaking her head. "No, sir. Not that I recall." She was lying. He had known Evelyn long enough to recognize the subtle shift in her tone, the way her fingers twitched at her sides. She was hiding something. Henry turned back to Grace, pushing the suspicion aside for the moment. "And you never wondered where you came from?" Of course I did, she admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. But I never had anything to go on. No name, no memories. Just this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, delicate locket. Henry's breath hitched. She opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside. A picture of a woman. Henry's heart nearly stopped. It was old, water-damaged, but he knew that face. Margaret, his wife, Emily's mother. Henry reached out, his fingers trembling as he took the locket from her hands. His vision blurred for a moment. How was this possible? How could she have this? Where did you get this? His voice was barely above a whisper. Grace hesitated. I don't know. I've always had it. It's the only thing I had when they found me. Henry squeezed the locket so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. The birthmark, the missing childhood memories, the locket that belonged to his wife. Someone had erased her past, and someone had made sure Henry never found her. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Who? And why? Grace shifted under his stare. Mr. Sullivan, why are you looking at me like that? Henry took a shaky breath and forced himself to smile, though it felt unnatural. He couldn't tell her, not yet. If someone had hidden her, if someone had taken her away from him, they wouldn't want the truth to come out now. He had to be careful. He let out a slow exhale and set the locket on the desk. It's just familiar. She studied him for a moment before offering a small, hesitant smile. Maybe I remind you of someone. You have no idea. Evelyn cleared her throat. Mr. Sullivan, if you're feeling unwell, I can arrange for. No, he interrupted, his voice firm. Grace will stay. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. He saw it again, that flicker of something she was trying to hide. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned to leave. Grace hesitated before speaking again. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Sullivan. I really do, and I hope we can get along. Henry forced himself to nod, though his mind was spinning. Yes, I hope so too. That night, Henry sat alone in his study, the dim light of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The locket sat in front of him, next to the old photograph of Emily. His hands shook as he reached for the phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, a number he swore he'd never call again. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. This is Calloway. Henry's throat tightened. David, it's Henry Sullivan. There was a pause. Sullivan? After all these years? Henry clenched his jaw. I need your help. David Calloway had been the private investigator Henry had hired all those years ago. He had worked the case for years, long after the police had closed it. And then one day he walked away. I thought you gave up, David said, his voice unreadable. Henry's grip tightened around the phone. I found her. Silence. Then, finally, where? She's in my house. Another pause, longer this time. When David spoke again, his voice was different, tense, careful. Henry, listen to me. If she's there, it means someone put her there. And if they put her there, they're watching. A chill ran down Henry's spine. David continued. You need to be smart about this. If she's really Emily, then someone spent 30 years making sure you never found out. And if she's in your house now, they have a reason for it. Henry swallowed hard. Then help me find out what they're hiding. David let out a slow breath. Fine, but if you do this, there's no turning back. Henry's eyes flickered to the photograph on his desk. There was never any turning back. As he hung up the phone, his gaze drifted toward the hallway. He could hear Grace moving around in the guest room, unaware of the storm she had just stepped into. But as Henry turned off the lamp and settled into the darkness, he didn't notice the shadow standing outside the house, watching, waiting. Henry barely slept that night. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, memories, and the suffocating weight of something that felt dangerously close to hope. It had been years since he allowed himself to feel it. Hope had been a cruel companion, always leading him to dead ends, to disappointment, to more heartache. But this was different. This wasn't just a desperate man clinging to a fading dream. Grace was real. Her birthmark was real. The locket was real. And now, as the sun began to rise, casting a muted golden glow through the grand windows of his estate, he knew one thing with certainty. Someone had stolen his daughter. The question that tormented him now was why. He sat at the breakfast table, staring blankly at the untouched coffee Evelyn had poured for him. She moved about the kitchen as if nothing had changed, as if the ground beneath their feet hadn't just shifted in a way neither of them could undo. But Henry saw it now, how she avoided his gaze, how her hands trembled ever so slightly when she set down a plate, how the lines around her mouth deepened in a way that only happened when she was hiding something. Grace entered the dining room then, a soft smile on her face. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan." Henry looked up at her. It was still unsettling, this feeling that he was looking at someone he had known all his life, someone he had once held in his arms, read bedtime stories to, carried on his shoulders through apple orchards in the fall. And yet, she didn't know him at all. "Good morning, Grace," he said, forcing a smile. She hesitated, then took a seat across from him. "I just wanted to say thank you again for this opportunity. I know it must not be easy to have a stranger living in your home, but I promise to do my best to make this transition smooth for you." Henry studied her carefully. There was a warmth to her, a sincerity that made his chest ache. He wanted to reach across the table to tell her everything, to demand to know if she remembered anything at all. But David's words echoed in his head. "If she's really Emily, then someone spent 30 years making sure you never found out. And if she's in your house now, they have a reason for it." He swallowed the questions burning on his tongue. "You're not a stranger, Grace. Not anymore." She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, I hope to make myself useful around here. Is there anything specific you'd like me to help with today?" Before Henry could answer, Evelyn placed a plate in front of her. "You should eat, dear. You have a long day ahead." Grace offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, Evelyn." Henry's eyes flickered between the two women. Evelyn was good at keeping her composure, but he didn't miss the way she watched Grace just a little too closely, like she was waiting for something. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Later that morning, when Grace had stepped outside to get fresh air, Henry found Evelyn in the library, dusting shelves that had already been dusted. She wasn't reading, but he could tell she was thinking. "How long are you going to pretend, Evelyn?" His voice was low, sharp. Evelyn froze. For a moment, she didn't turn around. Then, slowly, she set down the cloth and turned to face him. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Sullivan." Henry's patience snapped. "Don't lie to me. Not now." He stepped closer, voice shaking. "You knew. The moment she walked into this house, you knew. So tell me, Evelyn, how long have you known?" Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came out. Her hands trembled at her sides. She was usually composed, unwavering, but now she looked afraid. Henry's heart pounded. "What do you know?" His voice was almost a whisper. Evelyn inhaled shakily. "It's not what you think, sir." "Then tell me what it is." She hesitated, glancing toward the window as if afraid someone might be listening. Finally, she met his gaze. "You need to stop looking for the past, Henry." His blood turned cold. "You were there," he realized, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were in my home when Emily disappeared. You knew Margaret. You knew Emily. And now, after all these years, you're telling me to stop looking." Evelyn's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Because the past isn't what you remember it to be." Henry's breath hitched. "What are you saying?" But Evelyn shook her head, stepping back. "I can't." "You can. You will." Evelyn's gaze darted toward the hallway, toward where Grace had just been. "If you love your daughter, Mr. Sullivan, you'll stop asking questions." Henry felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Evelyn turned to leave, but he grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not forceful. His voice was barely a whisper. "If you know something about my daughter, and you've been keeping it from me all these years, I will never forgive you." For the first time in 20 years, he saw guilt in her eyes. And that was all the confirmation he needed. That night, Henry sat in his study, waiting. The moment the grandfather clock struck midnight, his phone rang. David. Henry picked up. "Tell me you found something." David exhaled heavily. "I did. And you're not going to like it." Henry's grip tightened around the receiver. "Tell me." There was a long pause. Then, Emily didn't disappear the night of the storm. Henry's body went rigid. David's voice was grave. "Someone took her." The breath rushed from Henry's lungs. David continued. "I dug through old adoption records. Nothing. But then I started looking into missing child reports from that time. Henry, Emily wasn't declared dead by the police. Someone filed paperwork to have her removed from the system. They wiped her existence." Henry felt dizzy. "Who?" Another pause. "You're not going to like the answer." Henry's voice was ice. "Tell me." David sighed. "Your wife's family, Henry. Margaret's parents. They were powerful. And they had secrets." Henry's stomach churned. He had never been close with his in-laws. Margaret had been distant from them too. But this, David's voice dropped lower. "I think Margaret knew something was wrong before she died." Henry's heart pounded. David hesitated. "There's one more thing." Henry swallowed. "What?" "The night of the storm," David said. "There's a record of a woman making a call to an emergency line. A distressed call about a child. It was never followed up on. Never recorded as an official case. And the woman who made the call." Henry's chest tightened. "It wasn't Margaret." Silence stretched between them. Henry's mind raced. Someone else had called for help that night. Someone who knew what was happening. Someone who had been trying to stop it. Henry closed his eyes. And then a new question formed. If Margaret wasn't the one who called, then who was? In the hallway, Grace stirred in her sleep, unaware of the storm unraveling around her. Henry sat in the dimly lit study, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk as David's words echoed in his mind. Someone took her. Someone erased her from existence. Someone made sure I would never find her. He felt a surge of nausea, his stomach twisting violently as memories of that night came rushing back. The storm, the flood, Margaret's scream, Emily's small hand slipping from his grasp. For 30 years, he had believed she had been lost to the water, stolen by the raging river. But now, the truth was clawing its way to the surface, threatening to consume him. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Evelyn's words from earlier rang in his ears. "If you love your daughter, you'll stop asking questions." But how could he? How could he stop when he was closer than he had ever been? His fingers trembled as he reached for the locket on his desk. The one Grace had carried her entire life. A piece of Margaret. A piece of the past that refused to stay buried. He had spent decades haunted by what-ifs, by questions with no answers. But now there were answers, dark, hidden answers. And Evelyn knew them. The house was silent as he stepped into the hallway, the grand estate cloaked in darkness. He moved with quiet precision, his steps careful as he approached Evelyn's quarters. She had been with him for so long, had cared for his home, had watched him drown in sorrow year after year. And yet, she had kept a secret so devastating that it threatened to upend everything. He pushed open the door without knocking. Evelyn was sitting in the armchair near the window, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't flinch, didn't look surprised. It was almost as if she had been expecting him. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across her face, making her expression unreadable. "You lied to me," Henry said, his voice low and controlled. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her skirt. "I never lied, Mr. Sullivan. I simply never told you the truth." His jaw clenched. "That's the same thing." She looked away, her gaze settling on the small clock on her nightstand. "You shouldn't be digging into this. There are things you don't understand. Things that will only bring you more pain." Henry took a step closer. "I've spent my entire life in pain, Evelyn. The only thing worse than pain is not knowing. So tell me what you've been hiding." She hesitated, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. "It wasn't supposed to be this way." "What wasn't?" Henry pressed. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were gathering the courage to speak. And then, finally, she whispered, "Margaret's parents." Henry's breath caught. "What about them?" Evelyn exhaled shakily. "They were powerful, Henry. You know that. But you never knew how powerful. Margaret, she never told you everything. She was afraid." Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. Afraid of what? Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to regret. Afraid of what they would do if she tried to keep Emily. The room tilted. Henry reached for the back of the chair to steady himself. "What are you saying?" His voice was barely a whisper. Evelyn swallowed hard. "They didn't want you to have Emily, Henry. They wanted control. They wanted Margaret to follow their rules. And when she didn't," her voice broke slightly, "they took her." Henry felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. No, that wasn't possible. That wasn't. They staged it." Evelyn continued, her voice haunted. "The storm, the accident. It was all real, but Emily wasn't lost that night. Someone was waiting. Someone took her before she could be swept away." Henry's legs nearly gave out beneath him. He had spent 30 years grieving, 30 years believing the river had taken her. And all this time she had been alive. Taken. Stolen. His hands clenched into fists. "Why?" Evelyn hesitated. "Because Margaret ran from them, Henry. She tried to cut ties. She thought she could build a life with you, away from their influence. But they weren't the kind of people you could escape from." Henry's body shook with barely restrained rage. "And you knew this? All these years?" Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I knew pieces of it. I didn't know everything. I didn't know where they took her. I only knew that they had. And She looked away, her voice breaking. "I was too afraid to tell you. Because if they had the power to take her, they had the power to hurt you too." Henry's chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths. "You should have told me." Evelyn wiped at her eyes. "And what would you have done? Gone to the police? You think the police would have gone against a family like the Whitmores?" The name sent a shiver down his spine. The Whitmores, Margaret's family. Her parents, who had always looked down on Henry, who had never approved of their marriage. He had known they were controlling. But this was monstrous. He turned, his hands gripping his hair as he struggled to breathe. Grace had been raised as someone else because of them. She had been forced to live a life that wasn't hers. And now she was here. Henry's head snapped up. If they went through so much trouble to hide her from me, why is she here now? Evelyn hesitated. Then softly, she said, "That's what you need to figure out." Henry turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. The house was silent as he made his way down the hallway, his mind racing. He needed to talk to David. He needed to find out if there were still ties between the Whitmores and Grace's past. But as he reached for his phone, a noise caught his attention. A soft voice. A whisper. He followed the sound, his breath shallow, his heart thudding. Grace was in her room talking, but she wasn't alone. He could hear another voice. A man's voice. Henry stepped closer, pressing his ear to the door. "I don't understand," Grace was saying, her voice laced with confusion. "Why now?" A pause. Then, the man's voice, low and unreadable. "Because it's time, Grace. You were never meant to stay hidden forever." Henry's blood ran cold. Who was she talking to? And more importantly, what did they mean by "it's time"? Henry stood frozen outside Grace's door, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice on the other side was deep, calm, deliberate. A man. Someone she knew. Someone who had been waiting for her. "Because it's time, Grace. You were never meant to stay hidden forever." Henry's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He forced himself to stay quiet, to listen, though every instinct screamed at him to burst in and demand answers. Grace hesitated. "I don't understand. Why now? Why after all these years?" The man's voice was softer now, almost soothing. "Because he's dying." Henry's breath caught in his throat. A long silence stretched between them. Then Grace whispered, "So that's why you sent me here." Henry pressed himself closer to the door, struggling to steady his shaking hands. "Grace," the man sighed. "This was always the plan. You were never supposed to stay away forever. You were supposed to come back when it was time." Grace sounded unsure now. "But I don't remember anything. What if this is a mistake? What if I'm not?" The man cut her off. "You know that's not true. You feel it, don't you?" Another pause. Then, almost too quiet to hear, Grace murmured, "I do." Henry's stomach twisted. She knew. On some level, she knew. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. He had heard enough. He took a slow step back, exhaling carefully as he turned away. His hands were still trembling as he walked down the dimly lit hallway, his mind spinning. Who was that man? How long had he been speaking to Grace? Had he sent her here? And if so, why? Henry barely registered the grand staircase beneath his feet as he descended to the first floor. He needed answers. He needed them now. The study door loomed ahead. He closed it behind him, locking it before snatching up his phone. He dialed David's number with shaking hands. It rang once, twice, then, "Sullivan." Henry gripped the phone tightly. "They sent her to me." David was silent for a long moment. "Who?" "Grace. She didn't come here by accident. Someone sent her here." Henry's breath was coming faster now, panic rising in his chest. "I just heard her talking to someone. A man. He said she was never meant to stay hidden forever. That it was time." David swore under his breath. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No." Henry swallowed hard. "But Grace did." David was quiet again. Then, carefully, "You said something about the Whitmores, about how they were involved." Henry exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Evelyn confirmed it. Margaret's parents took Emily. They erased her identity. They made sure I never found her." David sighed. "Then they must have had a reason for bringing her back now. And if that's the case, Henry..." Henry's grip tightened on the phone. "What?" David's voice was grim. "It means whatever they wanted from her isn't over yet." A cold dread settled in Henry's stomach. David continued, "I don't like this, Sullivan. If they went through all the trouble to erase her from your life, why give her back? Why now?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "Because I'm dying." Silence. Then, softly, David murmured, "That's not a coincidence." Henry ran a hand down his face, his mind racing. There was something bigger at play here, something he wasn't seeing. He thought back to Evelyn's warnings, to the way she had looked at Grace, the guilt in her eyes. And then something else struck him. If the Whitmores had taken Emily, and if they had gone through all the trouble to erase her past, why did Evelyn know about it? He had assumed she had learned the truth over the years, piecing things together the way he had. But what if? Henry's breath stilled. What if she had known all along? His pulse thundered in his ears. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Evelyn wasn't just a witness to what had happened. She was involved. Henry's fingers tightened around the phone. "David, I need you to dig deeper. Find out everything you can about the Whitmores. And I need you to find out who else was involved." David exhaled sharply. "You're thinking Evelyn." "I know it's Evelyn," Henry said, his voice dark. "And I'm done waiting for her to tell me the truth." The call ended. Henry shoved the phone into his pocket and turned toward the door. His heart pounded as he moved down the hallway, his steps hard and deliberate against the polished wood floors. Evelyn was in the kitchen, washing dishes, pretending as if nothing had changed. Henry stepped inside, his voice sharp. "We need to talk." She froze. Slowly, she set the dish down. She wiped her hands on a towel before turning to face him. "Henry," she murmured, carefully composed. "What is it?" Henry's chest rose and fell heavily. "How long have you known?" Evelyn's fingers tightened around the towel. "Known what?" "Don't," he snapped. "Don't play games with me. You knew. You knew she was alive. You knew where she was. And you let me suffer." Evelyn's breath hitched, but she kept her expression neutral. 30 years, Evelyn." Henry's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I grieved her. I searched for her. I never stopped looking. And all this time you knew. Her face crumpled. For a moment it looked as if she might deny it. But then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. I didn't know where she was, she whispered. But I knew what happened to her. Henry's stomach churned. And you never told me. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. I couldn't. Why? Her lips trembled. Because I was the one who made the call that night. The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Evelyn's voice broke. I tried to save her. I tried to stop them. But I was too late. Henry's world tilted. You knew Margaret's parents took her. His voice was hollow. And you did nothing. I did something. Evelyn's hands trembled. I called for help. I begged someone to look into it. But by the time they did, she was already gone. Henry swallowed hard. You let me believe she was dead, he whispered. Evelyn's eyes shone with regret. I didn't have a choice. Henry turned away, his head spinning. He couldn't look at her. Not now. A long silence stretched between them before Evelyn spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. They brought her back for a reason, Henry. He turned to her slowly. She met his gaze, something dark in her eyes. The Whitmores don't do anything without an agenda. And if they've sent her back to you now, after all this time, it's because they need her for something. Henry's blood turned to ice. He exhaled shakily, his voice barely audible. What do they want from her? Evelyn swallowed hard. That's what you need to find out. Henry's chest tightened. He had spent 30 years searching for his daughter. And now, as he stood in the center of the life he had built without her, he realized one horrifying truth. Finding her was only the beginning. Henry sat in his study, his fingers pressed against his temples as Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. The Whitmores don't do anything without an agenda. If they've sent her back to you now, it's because they need her for something. He felt sick. For 30 years, he had believed Emily was lost to the river, stolen by the storm. But now, the truth was unraveling in ways he never could have imagined. His in-laws, powerful, ruthless, controlling, had taken her, had erased her, and now, after all these years, they had brought her back. Not because they had grown a conscience. Not because they had regretted their actions. No, because they needed something from her. His breath came shallow and uneven as he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through every possibility. He had spent decades mourning a daughter who had never truly been gone. And now he had her back. But he wasn't the only one who wanted her. The soft knock at the door startled him. He straightened, quickly composing himself before calling out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Grace stepped inside, her presence like a quiet storm. She looked hesitant, her hands clasped together as she studied him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Henry forced a smile, though his chest felt like it was caving in. "Of course not. Come in." She stepped forward, her gaze flickering across the bookshelves, the old wooden desk, the walls lined with memories of a life she had no recollection of. "This house," she murmured almost to herself. "It feels familiar." Henry swallowed hard. "Maybe because it is." She looked at him, uncertainty flickering in her deep brown eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, I have to ask, why did you hire me? You could have chosen anyone, but you picked me." Henry studied her carefully. She was starting to piece things together, starting to sense that there was something more beneath the surface. He had to tread carefully. "Something about you felt right." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Henry hesitated, then exhaled. "I've lost a lot in my life, Grace, more than most. And when I met you, I saw something familiar in you." He forced himself to hold her gaze. "Have you ever felt like you belonged somewhere, even when you didn't understand why?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Recognition, perhaps. "Yes," she whispered. "I feel that way here." Henry's chest ached. She turned away, walking toward the bookshelf, running her fingers lightly over the spines of books that had been there since before she was born. "I keep having dreams," she admitted softly. Dreams of a woman. I don't see her face, but I hear her voice. She's singing to me. She turned back to Henry, her expression unreadable. It's the same lullaby that plays in this house. Henry's throat tightened. Margaret's lullaby. Grace exhaled shakily. I don't know why, but I think I knew her. Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to take her hands, show her the pictures, tell her everything. But something inside him warned him to wait. If the Whitmores had gone to such extreme lengths to hide her from him, revealing the truth too soon might put her in danger. Instead, he said, "Maybe you did." Grace searched his face, as if looking for an answer he wasn't giving her. Finally, she sighed, shaking her head. "I feel like my whole life has been built on something false. Like I'm standing on a foundation that isn't real." Henry's voice was quiet. "What do you want to do about it?" She swallowed. "I want to find out who I really am." Henry nodded slowly. "Then let's find out together." That night, Henry waited until the house was silent before making his next move. Evelyn's words still burned in his mind. They need her for something. Whatever it was, he wasn't going to sit around and wait for the Whitmores to make the next move. He dialed David's number. The phone rang once before David answered. "Sullivan?" Henry kept his voice low. "We need to move faster. She's starting to remember things." David exhaled sharply. "That's either good news or very bad news." Henry's jaw clenched. "I need to know what they want from her." David hesitated. "I might have something, but you're not gonna like it." Henry's grip tightened around the phone. "Tell me." David's voice dropped lower. "The Whitmores are dying out, Henry. Their empire, their wealth. It's all built on fragile ground. And it turns out Emily, or should I say Grace, is the key to keeping it from falling apart." Henry's blood ran cold. David continued. "Margaret was supposed to be the heir to their fortune. When she cut ties, they lost control of her and by extension, her child. But now, with Margaret gone and you out of the picture, Emily is the last link to their legacy." Henry gritted his teeth. "So that's why they took her." "More than that," David murmured. "They took her so they could mold her into what they needed her to be. But something must have changed. Because instead of keeping her, they sent her back to you." Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. "Why?" David's voice was grim. "Because they're losing power. And I think they need her to fix that." Henry exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The Whitmores had spent years controlling their bloodline, manipulating every aspect of their empire. They had stolen his daughter, stripped her of her identity, and rebuilt her into something else. And now, for whatever reason, they had returned her to him. Not out of kindness, not out of guilt, but because she was useful to them. Henry's jaw tightened. They think they can use her, but they're wrong. David was silent for a moment. Then softly he said, "Be careful, Sullivan. These people don't take kindly to losing control." Henry's gaze darkened. "Neither do I." He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His mind was clearer now, sharper. The Whitmores had made their move. Now it was his turn. As he sat in the quiet of his study, a thought settled deep in his bones. They had taken his daughter once. They would not take her again. Henry barely slept. The house felt heavier now, like the walls were closing in, suffocating him under the weight of everything that had remained hidden for so long. Grace was his daughter. He had no doubt now. The way she moved through the house, the way she responded to the memories buried deep inside her. It was Emily, even if she didn't know it yet. But what haunted him more than anything was the truth David had uncovered. The Whitmores hadn't returned her out of guilt. They had done it because they needed her. They had shaped her into someone else, stripped her of her past. And now, after 30 years, they were here to claim what they believed was theirs. Henry sat in the dim glow of his study, staring at the fire flickering in the hearth. His fingers curled tightly around the armrests of his chair as Evelyn's words rang in his ears. "If you love your daughter, you'll stop asking questions." But it was too late for that. He had already opened the door to the truth, and now he was standing in the middle of a storm he couldn't escape. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. He looked up just as Grace appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the dim light of the hallway. She hesitated before stepping inside, her fingers gripping the edges of her sleeves. "I couldn't sleep." Henry forced a small smile. "Neither could I." She moved closer, her eyes flickering over the room. "It's strange," she murmured. "I feel comfortable here." She paused, then corrected herself. "No, that's not the right word. It's more than that. It feels safe." Henry swallowed hard. "It should." Grace hesitated, then sighed. "I have a question." Henry straightened. "Go on." She bit her lip, looking almost guilty. "That woman in the portraits. The one with the kind eyes." She looked up at him, her voice softer now. "Who was she?" Henry felt his chest tighten. "Margaret," he said after a moment, his voice hoarse. "My wife. Emily's mother." Grace nodded slowly. "She looks familiar to me." Henry's heart clenched. "She should." Grace exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "I keep getting these flashes," she admitted. "Memories, I think, but they don't make sense. It's like trying to hold on to smoke." She looked at him, something desperate in her gaze. "I want to remember." Henry leaned forward. "Then let me help you." She hesitated. "How?" Henry reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a small box. He set it on the table between them and slowly opened the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a delicate silver bracelet. Grace's breath hitched the moment she saw it. She reached out, hesitantly running her fingers over the small charms. "I've seen this before." Henry nodded. "You used to wear it every day." Grace's eyes welled up. "I don't know why, but I feel like crying." Henry's voice was thick. "Because it's yours, Grace. It's always been yours." She looked up at him, something breaking in her expression. "Who am I?" Henry took a slow breath, steadying himself. "You're my daughter." Grace froze. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Her lips parted slightly, her breath coming in shallow waves. "What did you say?" she whispered. Henry held her gaze, his own eyes glistening. "You're my daughter, Grace. You were taken from me, and I've spent 30 years trying to find you." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "That can't be. You know it's true." Grace let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. "I don't remember." "But you feel it," Henry said gently. She let out a quiet sob. "I do." Henry reached out, hesitating before placing his hand over hers. "I don't know everything they did to you, but I do know that you're not who they told you you were. And neither of us are going to stop until we uncover the rest of the truth." Grace wiped at her tears, her expression hardening with determination. "Then let's do it." Henry's jaw clenched. "We will." A beat of silence passed before she asked, "Where do we start?" Before Henry could answer, the sound of a phone buzzing cut through the air. He glanced at his desk. It wasn't his. Grace quickly pulled her phone from her pocket. Her expression darkened. Henry leaned forward. "Who is it?" She hesitated before turning the screen toward him. "An unknown number." Henry's stomach twisted. "Answer it." Grace took a deep breath, then pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello." Silence. Then, a soft voice, a woman's voice. "You shouldn't be there, Grace." Grace's breath hitched. "Who is this?" A pause. Then, "They're watching." Henry shot up from his seat. "Put it on speaker." Grace did as he said, her hands trembling. "Who is this?" The woman's voice was eerily calm. "You need to leave that house. You're not safe." Henry's stomach dropped. "Who are you?" he demanded. Silence. Then, just before the line went dead, the woman whispered one final warning. "They're coming for her." The call ended. Grace stared at the phone, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Henry clenched his fists. "Pack your things." Grace looked up at him. "What?" "We're leaving." She frowned. "Where?" Henry's jaw tightened. "Somewhere they can't find you." A flicker of fear crossed Grace's face, but she quickly steadied herself. "I trust you," Henry exhaled sharply. "Good, because I'm not letting them take you again." He turned on his heel, already planning their next move. But as he reached for his phone to call David, he didn't notice the dark figure standing just beyond the property gates. Watching, waiting, Henry moved quickly, his mind racing through every possible escape plan. The warning on the phone call hadn't been a coincidence. They're coming for her. The Whitmores had let her go for a reason. But now, something had changed. They weren't done with her yet, and Henry wasn't about to sit around and wait for them to make their next move. Grace stood in the middle of the room, her breath unsteady, her hands shaking as she clutched the phone to her chest. He could see the war inside her. The fear, the confusion, the undeniable sense that everything she had known was crumbling beneath her feet. He had lived in that place for 30 years, and now she was standing on the edge of it, staring down into the abyss. "We need to go," Henry said, grabbing his coat from the chair. Grace blinked, snapping out of her daze. "Go where?" "Somewhere safe," Henry answered quickly. "Somewhere they won't find you." Grace took a step forward. "You think they're actually coming for me?" Henry's jaw clenched. "I know they are." Her breath hitched, but she didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." Henry felt a swell of pride beneath the urgency. Despite everything, she wasn't breaking. She wasn't running in fear. She was standing her ground. That was Margaret's fire in her veins. That was the daughter he had lost. They moved through the house swiftly, Henry leading her down the hallway, past the grand staircase, toward the back entrance. He didn't know how much time they had. Hours? Minutes? The Whitmores weren't careless people. If they had made the decision to take her back, they wouldn't waste time. As they reached the back door, Evelyn appeared at the end of the hall. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "You can't run from them," she said softly. Henry didn't slow down. "Watch me." Evelyn took a step forward. "Henry, listen to me." "I listened to you for 30 years, Henry snapped, turning to face her. "I trusted you, and you knew. You knew she was alive, and you let me believe she was dead." Evelyn's eyes shone with guilt. "I did what I had to do to protect her." Henry's breath was ragged. "And now they're coming to take her back." Evelyn didn't respond. That silence was enough. Henry turned away, pushing open the door. The cold air rushed in, wrapping around them like an omen. He grabbed Grace's wrist gently but firmly. "Come on." They stepped outside. The night was thick with fog, the estate grounds stretching into the distance. Henry led her toward the car, parked discreetly near the back gate. As they neared it, Grace suddenly froze. "Wait." Henry turned sharply. "We don't have time." She was staring at the car. Not at the vehicle itself, but at something just beyond it. A figure, standing at the gate, watching. Henry's blood ran cold. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his posture rigid. His face was hidden in the shadows, but Henry could feel the weight of his gaze. "Get in the car," Henry ordered. Grace hesitated. "Who is that?" Henry didn't answer. He stepped forward, positioning himself in front of her. His entire body was taut, adrenaline flooding his veins. "Who are you?" The man took a slow step forward, and then he spoke. "She's been gone long enough, Mr. Sullivan." The voice was calm, measured. Henry had heard it before. On the phone, Grace stiffened behind him. Henry's grip on her wrist tightened. "You're not taking her." The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. "You don't have a choice." Henry exhaled sharply. "She's not yours to take." A pause. Then the man took another step forward. "She was never yours to keep." Henry's pulse thundered. "She's my daughter." The man sighed, almost as if he pitied him. "She's more than that now." Grace clutched Henry's sleeve. "Dad, let's go." Henry's heart clenched at the word. That. It was the first time she had said it, and he would not let them take that away from him. Without another word, he pulled her toward the car, yanking the door open. "Get in." Grace scrambled into the passenger seat as Henry slid into the driver's side. His hands were steady, despite the storm raging inside him. The man at the gate didn't move. He simply stood there, watching, waiting. Henry started the engine. And then the man's final words cut through the night. "This isn't over." Henry hit the gas. The tires screeched as they tore down the long, winding road leading away from the estate. The headlights cut through the darkness, but Henry's mind was already 10 steps ahead. They needed a plan. They needed somewhere safe. Grace turned to him, her face pale. "Who was that?" Henry tightened his grip on the wheel. "Someone who thinks he owns you." She swallowed hard. "What do they want?" Henry exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Control." Grace looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "How do we stop them?" Henry's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. The estate was disappearing into the distance. But the fight was far from over. "We find out the truth," he said. "And then we take away their power." Grace nodded slowly. Henry pressed the accelerator harder. The Whitmores had taken everything from him once. They would not do it again. The road stretched endlessly before them, swallowed by the night. Henry's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his mind racing. Grace sat beside him, silent, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside the window. Neither of them spoke, but the weight of everything unspoken filled the car like a thick fog. They had left the estate behind, but Henry knew they weren't free. Not yet. The Whitmores didn't let go of something they considered theirs. And they considered Grace theirs. The headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the empty road ahead. Henry stole a glance at Grace. She looked lost in thought, her hands clasped together in her lap. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that he would protect her. But the truth was, he didn't know if he could. The Whitmores had already proven they would go to any lengths to get what they wanted. And right now, they wanted her back. After what felt like an eternity, Grace finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "Where are we going?" Henry kept his eyes on the road. "Somewhere safe." Grace frowned. "Safe from who?" Henry exhaled sharply. He couldn't keep her in the dark any longer. "The Whitmores." Grace shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. "Why do they care about me now? After all these years?" Henry clenched his jaw. "Because they need you." Grace swallowed hard. "For what?" Henry hesitated. How could he tell her the truth when he didn't even know the full extent of it himself? He knew one thing for certain. They didn't just want her back because of who she was. They wanted her back because of what she represented. He glanced at her. "They see you as their legacy, their future. You're the last link to their power." Grace let out a shaky breath, turning to look out the window. "But I don't remember them. I don't remember any of it." Henry's grip on the wheel tightened. "That's because they made sure you wouldn't." The car fell into silence again. The weight of his words hung between them. Then softly, Grace murmured, "I don't know who I am." Henry's heart clenched. "You're my daughter." She turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "But I don't feel like her." Henry inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "That's because they took that from you. But it's still there, Grace. You just have to find it again." She looked away, blinking rapidly. Henry could see the turmoil in her. She had spent her whole life believing she was someone else. And now, she was being told that everything she knew was a lie. He couldn't imagine how lost she must feel. But he would help her find her way back. They drove for hours, pushing farther away from the estate, deeper into the unknown. Henry didn't stop until they reached a small, secluded motel on the outskirts of a quiet town. The neon sign flickered as he pulled into the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was off the grid. That was all that mattered. He killed the engine and turned to Grace. "We'll stay here for the night." She nodded, but he could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her shoulders sagged. Inside, the motel room was small and outdated, but it was clean. Henry double-checked the locks on the door and the windows before finally allowing himself to breathe. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees. "What now?" Henry sat across from her. Now we figure out our next move. Grace let out a small, bitter laugh. I don't even know where to start. Henry studied her carefully. You said you've been having dreams. She nodded slowly. Yeah, flashes mostly. A woman singing. A house with a white fence. A man's voice, but I can't see his face. She exhaled. And lately, I've been hearing my name. Emily. Henry's throat tightened. That's because it's who you are. Grace pressed her lips together, struggling to process everything. Henry reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photograph. He hesitated before handing it to her. Grace took it carefully, her fingers trembling. It was an old photo, a picture of Henry, Margaret, and Emily. The last picture taken before the storm. Grace stared at it, her breath shallow. That's me? Henry nodded. Yes. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the image with her fingertips. I look happy. Henry's voice was hoarse. You were. Grace inhaled sharply, pressing the photo against her chest. I don't know why, but I feel it. Henry's heart pounded. What do you feel? Grace wiped at her eyes, letting out a small, shaky laugh. Like I'm home. Henry's vision blurred with unshed tears. She was remembering. Slowly but surely she was remembering. Before he could say anything else, Grace's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She stiffened. Henry grabbed it before she could, his stomach twisting as he looked at the screen. Another unknown number. Without hesitation, he answered. Who is this? A pause. Then the same voice from before. The same calm, measured tone. You can't run forever, Mr. Sullivan. Henry's grip on the phone tightened. Stay away from her. The man on the other end sighed. You don't understand, do you? This was never about you. Henry's blood turned to ice. The man continued, his voice slow, deliberate. You think you took her back, but the truth is, we let her go. Henry's chest constricted. They had let her go? The Whitmores weren't the kind of people to make mistakes. They didn't just lose things. If they had let Grace, Emily, return to him, then it meant they were done with her. Or worse, they were setting her up for something much bigger. What do you want? Henry demanded. The man chuckled. Oh, Henry, you should be asking her that. The call ended. Henry lowered the phone slowly, his heart pounding. Grace stared at him, her hands gripping the edge of the bed. What did they say? Henry exhaled sharply. They didn't lose you, Grace, he murmured. They let you go. Grace's expression crumpled. Why? Henry met her gaze, his stomach twisting. That's what we need to find out. The truth was close. He could feel it. But whatever the Whitmores wanted, it wasn't over yet. Henry barely felt the weight of the phone slip from his hand. The words from the unknown caller echoed in his mind, each syllable carving into his chest like a blade. You think you took her back, but the truth is, we let her go. He looked up at Grace, sitting across from him on the edge of the motel bed, her hands twisted together in her lap. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide with barely restrained panic. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry forced himself to stay calm, but inside, everything was unraveling. The Whitmores had spent 30 years ensuring Emily, Grace, was kept away from him, hidden from her past. They had taken her, erased her identity, made sure she would never find her way back. And now, after all these years, they had simply let her go? That didn't make sense. Unless she wasn't useful to them anymore. Or worse, unless she was about to be useful for something far more sinister. Henry clenched his jaw. We need to move. Now. Grace stiffened. Where? Somewhere they can't reach us. He stood, grabbing his coat, already calculating the next step. But before he could move, Grace shot to her feet. No. Henry froze. She looked up at him, her hands balled into fists. Her face was pale, but there was something else in her expression now. Determination. I'm done running, she said firmly. I want answers. Henry exhaled sharply. Grace. No, she interrupted, stepping closer. My whole life, I've been living in the dark. I've been feeling like I'm missing something, like there's this hole inside of me that I don't understand. And now I finally have the chance to figure out why. I'm not going to just walk away from it. Henry's throat tightened. They took everything from you. She swallowed hard. Then it's time to take it back. Henry studied her for a long moment. He saw Margaret in her now. That same fire, that same quiet but unyielding strength. She wasn't a child anymore. She had spent years being told who she was, being molded into something she wasn't. And now, for the first time, she was fighting for herself. Henry took a slow breath. All right. Grace blinked in surprise. Really? He nodded. But we do it my way. No risks. No rushing in blind. Grace let out a breath of relief. Okay. Henry pulled out his phone and dialed. The line rang once before David answered. Sullivan? Henry didn't waste time. I need everything you have on the Whitmores. Every business. Every connection. Every weakness. David exhaled sharply. You sure you want to do this? Henry's grip tightened around the phone. I should have done it years ago. David hesitated, then muttered, All right, give me an hour. The call ended. Henry turned back to Grace. You sure about this? She lifted her chin. Yes. Henry nodded. Then let's end this. An hour later, Henry and Grace sat in the car, parked outside a sleek, glass-walled building in the heart of the city, the Whitmore's headquarters. David's voice came through the speakerphone. Their main office is on the top floor. If you want answers, that's where you'll find them. Henry's jaw tightened. And security? Minimal at this time of night, David said. But I'd still be careful. Henry exhaled slowly. Got it. He ended the call and turned to Grace. You ready? Grace swallowed hard but nodded. Let's go. They stepped out of the car, walking with purpose toward the building's entrance. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears as they stepped inside, the marble floors gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A receptionist looked up, startled. Sir, I'm sorry, but the offices are closed for the evening. Henry met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Tell them Henry Sullivan is here. The woman hesitated, then picked up the phone, whispering into the receiver. A moment later, the elevator doors slid open. Grace stiffened beside him. Henry inhaled deeply. Stay close. They stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The ride to the top floor was silent. Then, with a soft chime, the doors opened. A spacious office stretched before them, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. And at the far end of the room, standing behind a large mahogany desk, was a man Henry hadn't seen in decades. Richard Whitmore. He was older now, his silver hair neatly combed, his expensive suit pristine. He looked up as they entered, his lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Well, he murmured, clasping his hands together. I was wondering when you'd finally come. Grace inhaled sharply beside Henry. Henry took a step forward, his expression unreadable. No more games. No more lies. Tell me the truth. Richard's smile didn't falter. Which truth would you like? The one you want to hear? Or the one that will ruin you? Henry's eyes darkened. Start with the truth about my daughter. Richard exhaled, almost as if he pitied him. Your daughter is standing beside you. Grace stiffened. Richard tilted his head. But you already knew that, didn't you? Henry clenched his fists. Why did you take her? Richard sighed. Because Margaret thought she could escape. She thought she could defy us. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. Richard continued, his voice calm, calculated. You were never part of our world, Henry. You were an outsider. And Margaret's biggest mistake was thinking she could build a life with you without consequence. Henry's hands shook with rage. So you stole my child? Richard shook his head. No, Henry. We saved her. Grace gasped. Saved me? Richard turned to her, his expression unreadable. We raised you to be strong, to be powerful, to carry on what was meant to be yours. Henry stepped in front of Grace. She was never yours. Richard's smile faded. That's where you're wrong. Henry exhaled sharply. Why now? Why send her back? Richard leaned back against his desk. Because it's time. Henry frowned. Time for what? Richard's gaze locked onto Grace. To choose. Grace's breath hitched. Choose. Richard nodded. You can leave now. Go back to whatever life you think is yours. Or, he tilted his head, you can embrace what you were meant to be. Henry's body went rigid. She's not choosing anything. Richard smirked. That's not for you to decide. Silence stretched between them. Then softly Richard spoke again. You think you won, Henry? You think you took her back? But the truth is, his eyes gleamed. She was never lost to begin with. Henry's breath stilled. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. What do you mean? Richard's smile widened. Somewhere, deep inside, you already know. Grace staggered back. And in that moment, everything, every missing memory, every buried truth, came crashing down around her. And just like that,